and everything, there's some lack of discernment there. The Lord says this woman, he says she's a Jezebel. Well, what did Jezebel do to make her name become an insult? I mean, nobody's naming their little girl Jezebel. That's not a popular name these days. That would be crazy. All right. Now there are crazy people, so maybe there are some ladies out there named Jezebel because their parents are just messed up. But you'd have to be messed up to name your daughter Jezebel. What did she do that ruined that name forever? Well, she didn't actually rebel against Ahab. You don't see her rebelling against him. What you do see is you see her taking authority that was Ahab's and going and acting in his authority, and then obviously causing Nabal to be killed. Obviously, she's a wicked woman. But when we say the word Jezebel, a lot of times we either think of somebody who's a seductress or somebody who is extremely rebellious. And the truth is, you don't actually see Jezebel in the Bible doing either of those things. She didn't seduce anybody. She caused someone to be killed. She manipulated people into doing evil things. She tried to destroy Elijah, tried to cause him to be killed. She's a wicked woman. She took her husband's power, his authority. He's the king. She took that and she wielded it as if it was her own. And she did wicked things with it. What this woman is doing is the same thing. I'm not saying that she was the pastor's wife. I kind of doubt it. I think he would have mentioned that. But what she is doing is she's taking the authority of this pastor and wielding it as if it was her own, and then she's doing wicked things with it. And she's causing other people to sin. It does so happen that this woman who's called a Jezebel does actually seduce. And so we see here there's two things in which she seduced this congregation. So it says here, and this is where we leave off dealing with the pastor. The Lord leaves off dealing with the pastor. Now he's going to give a message for this woman and her followers. It's kind of being said to the pastor, but he's not really addressing the pastor anymore. And then he's going to switch and he's going to give a message to the faithful members of the church who've not followed that woman. That's what we're going to see in this passage here, and we're not going to get much further today in looking at that. So before we go on to it, I just want to summarize about the pastor before we leave him completely here. He really was a wonderful man of faith, but he had advocated his position and allowed a woman to take over the church. And from this point on, the Lord doesn't even bother to continue addressing the pastor. He's not given an ultimatum like the pastors of Ephesus and Pergamos. He cannot fix the problem. My summary of this whole passage, this pastor, I would call him the kind-hearted, hardworking compromiser. That's what he is. The pastor of Thyatira, I'll say again, was the only one commended for his charity. He was a faithful, patient servant of the Lord with a heart full of love. Perhaps he let his compassion lead him into the error of feeling that he was protecting his flock by not being strong against sin and false doctrine. He may have valued unity over purity. Again, the lesson is taught that the pastor does not actually spare anyone from hardship by being a compromiser. He would not stand against the Jezebel in his church, and that may have temporarily saved the church from some drama and maybe preserved unity, but in the end, the Lord himself is going to deal with the sin, and it would have been far better for everyone if the pastor had just done his job and not let it get to that point. Not once do we see a pastor commended or condemned for unity or disunity in these churches. The Lord is concerned with the purity of his church. Purity of doctrine and morals produces unity as a natural side effect. But when unity is the goal, purity is sacrificed and both are lost. You end up with dissimulation. Dissimulation is counterfeit unity at the cost of purity. That's That's what we saw in Galatians, where Paul is talking about how Peter, when the men come from James, how Peter decides to act like, put on an act. That's what dissimulation means. It means an act. Put on an act of, I still separate from the Gentiles, even though they're Christians, and eat at a different table. And Paul said that even Barnabas was carried away with the dissimulation, with this act. Even he thought, this is the right thing to do. To preserve the peace, to preserve the unity, let's just act like we don't actually have this standard or this belief, and stand for the truth of the gospel. To avoid conflict with the other brethren, let's just act like we're in their camp. And Paul calls that dissimulation. And he says that it's such a bad thing that he withstands Peter to his face. I don't picture that Paul is standing there yelling at Peter. That would have been incorrect. Rebuke not an elder. And that word rebuke means a railing accusation. But then later in 1 Timothy 5, we're told, them that sin rebuke before all. That word rebuke is a different word for rebuke that actually means just to reveal the fault. There's a great difference between Paul standing before Peter and just asking the question, Peter, if thou, being a Jew, livest as do the Gentiles, why compellest thou the Gentiles to live as Jews? All he did was ask a question. We talked about the power of a question, right? That is a rebuke. It's a revealing of the sin, but it's not a railing accusation. He's not standing there. He's far younger than Peter, and Peter is one of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. And Paul is not. He's of a different generation of apostle. But he did stand for the truth. Peter and Barnabas were of the opinion, in this case, it's worth not standing for the truth to preserve unity. And what they got was dissimulation, which is just a false unity. It's a counterfeit, a fake unity. And the purity of the doctrine was sacrificed to obtain that. I believe we're in that situation in many, many churches in America, where to preserve the unity, we don't really stand hard against sin. And instead of achieving unity, where a pastor thinks that that's what the Lord requires of him, he's actually just achieving dissimulation, an act, hypocrisy, fake unity. And now you have neither true unity nor purity. And God is not requiring pastors to achieve unity. He's not getting on to these men or blessing these men because you've got a real unified church. I don't find that in here. If anything, he's rebuking these men for not stirring things up when it ought to be stirred up, not kicking up the dust over something that's worth having the dust kick up over. So, don't value unity over purity. Never see unity as the goal. Unity is a beautiful side effect of true purity. When everybody's of the same doctrine and of the same morals, guess what? We're unified. Okay, we're dismissed.